It would be a surprise to people, I'm sure, most people, to know that they no longer have property rights. They have something that is an appearance of a property right. At the end of a cycle like this, when the money is no longer driving real economic beneficial activity, as we see, it goes into financialization and into warfare. This is the threat we all face, creating such dire conditions that people will have no alternative. There will be no parallel system to which they can resort. So they will be forced to accept the central bank digital currency. Ultimately, there is no place to hide from this. It just has to be stopped.
Hi everybody, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome to a brand new episode of Reinvent Money, sponsored by Dutch precious metals broker Holland Gold. I'm honored to welcome today's guest to the show, David Rogers Webb. He wrote a groundbreaking book in May of last year that is freely available online and which sends shockwaves around the world. It's called The Great Taking and I urge you to read it if you haven't done so. David is a former hedge fund manager who one day had a near-death experience which led him to write this book, which describes how our system is legally set up in such a way that we could all lose our financial properties like stocks and bonds the moment the financial system blows up. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Yes, thanks so much for agreeing to be on the show. We have a mutual friend, Catherine Austin Fitz, that I had on the show last time. So thanks to her also for setting this interview up. And I've had so many comments and requests from our viewers and also customers to talk to you one day about your book, The Great Taking. Let's start off with the basics. What is The Great Taking all about?
Well, it's about a very deliberate plan that has been put in place. It required many years of work and decades, really, to implement this. So it's not an accident. And it is really about severing property rights to securities, stocks and bonds, which for 400 years were property. So personal property. So if your broker or bank failed, you would say, I'm sorry, you're out of business. Here's where you can send my stuff. And if they didn't, that was criminal theft. But, it would be a surprise to people, I'm sure, most people, to know that they no longer have property rights. They have something that is an appearance of a property right. You may see in your agreements the term beneficial ownership, which is sounds nice, but it's really just creating an appearance. Of course, you can buy and sell the security and have a gain or loss on that. You're paid interest or dividends. You receive a proxy statement, but all the while, you are not the legal owner of the security. The legal ownership is with the entity that controls it as collateral, and it is controlled elsewhere 100% of the time. All securities elsewhere are in pooled form, held in pooled form, and used regularly without restriction, without judicial review, and free of payment as collateral in the financial system by other interests.
Yeah, and you substantiate all that with a lot of legal documentation in your book. A lot of focus on the US, but also on Europe. Would you say this applies to the whole world or only in the collective West?
Well, I think I think Japan has been conformed to this also. I think I don't have insight into China or Russia, but the objective clearly has been to harmonize globally. on this basis. And as we know, I mean, this is really being driven by the central banking powers. And really, the entire world is controlled by these private central banking interests.
Because you also write about the Bank of International Settlements, and you put some evidence from their hand as well in the book. And of course, they oversee all central banks. But you moved to Sweden, let's say 12 years ago or so, thinking that things would be better in Europe, right? Because you saw what went on in the US, and you were worried about security rights in the US. And then you went to Europe, and you basically found out that things were not any better over here.
Well, no, actually, I got to Europe in time to try to prevent this from happening in Europe. So I worked at it for years. So beginning, I came for the first time in March of 2009, and at that time, Sweden still had book entry system. They had dematerialized as all of the G30 countries were forced to do, but Sweden did it in the right way, using the electronic records to actually have specific identification of who owned what. So that had to be subverted in Sweden. But in 2009, that was still the case. And that was the main reason that I moved to Sweden. And then I set about warning people here and in Europe not to go along with this and allow the change to be made here. So I met with the Minister for Financial Markets in Sweden and his state secretary, and they understood what I was talking about, and they did not disagree, and they said, well, we might not have to do it if the Germans will stand up to it. They were clearly saying little Sweden cannot resist this, but if big Germany will do it, maybe it won't happen. So that was probably in 2011 or so, somewhere in there, I had that meeting. And then in 2013, I spoke to a hedge fund conference in Zurich, really briefed them on this in detail. And people there understood, but they weren't going to do anything about it. And just some months later that year, the Central Securities Depository Regulation was enacted in Europe. And so that's at the EU level. That's what harmonizes this with the US system. But then it was also necessary to change local law at the national level in each case, as was done in Sweden in 2014 as well. So it took. I was there for 5 years warning people about it, but it happened anyway.
Yeah, and then 9 years later or 10 years later, you decided to write a book. Or was it already something you considered doing a few years back, or why now, or let's say why last year?
I think going through the COVID years led me to have real conviction about this, because the malevolence toward the population is so manifest. We're in a global hybrid war, and that is really my motivation. This is not about saving your investments. This is we are being threatened in a full spectrum way, and the purpose of the book, it's not an investment advice book. It is about something much bigger than that. And I really mean the great taking, because it's everything. And
yeah. So more than your assets, it's also about taking your liberties and your freedom in general.
Yeah, and complete subjugation. And in many ways, I mean, their objective is to take our humanity, our ability to, property. I one of the things I did in the U.S. was I had a weekend with G. Edward Griffin, talking with him. And he said that property is deep in not just in humans as an important thing for humans, but it seems to have its roots in animals as well, and it's deep. So the property relates to nesting. It's in birds and other types of it's having a territory, having a place, and it's related to the ability to reproduce, to have the stability to reproduce. So if property is taken away, it is crushing to people.
Yeah, it's the essence of life, indeed. And when you talk about they, that of course the $1 million question is always, who are they? Who are the architects, as you refer to them in the book? Could you be more specific about it, or is it also difficult for you to understand who's behind the curtain?
Well, no. The clearly the center of this is the people who control the private central banks. So it's the people behind certainly the Federal Reserve System. This has been the entities involved. The Fed is certainly involved. The Bank for International Settlements, the Bank of England is kind of the forerunner of all of this. So it's these are the people that really control and have these long-range plans, and everybody else works for that money power, which has its roots going back to the creation of the Federal Reserve, but then even before that, the Bank of England.
And what about, for example, the Dutch central bank? I live in Holland. They are owned by the state. You say all the central banks are privately owned. Is it then more about control instead of actual ownership? Could you elaborate on that?
Surprised if they are owned by the state. I think it's probably an appearance of ownership, as is the case in Russia as well. That's why, after the USSR was collapsed, the central bank in Russia was reconstituted. It has an appearance of being a state bank. In other words, the building is owned by the state, but there are other interests that actually control the bank, and even the Russian central bank is a member of the BIS.
Yeah, that's true. And so, what is the whole purpose then of? I understand why at some point, of course, all these paper administrations were digitized because it made trade easier. So I guess there's a benefit also, of course, for everyone involved, also private owners or like small guys like ourselves. And at some point, they started pooling all the assets and all the collateral, and they started setting up these central and international depositories. But what in the end, what was their plan then? So to execute the great taking, that was something they came up with already decades ago to get to that final goal to overtake most of the property?
I mean, okay, so the first thing that happened was what's called the paperwork crisis, which was clearly orchestrated. It began in 1968, June of 1968, 6 days after the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and roughly 60 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the paperwork crisis consisted of closing the New York Stock Exchange every Wednesday for 6 months. They paid the brokers bonuses to keep them happy through this period of time. And at the end of the year, it just stopped. But it was used as a rationale for creating the Depository Trust Corp. Now, what happened there? There is a guy named Robert Denser, who has written in his own memoir about this. He's done interviews about it, and he makes no secret about it. He was a career CIA guy. He started with the CIA out of college. The CIA arranged his draft deferment, and he worked in Europe, forming anti-communist student organizations. Then he worked explicitly for the CIA for half a dozen years. Then he went with the CIA to U.S. aid in Latin America, doing nice things down there. And then he says in his memoir that following the assassinations, his interest shifted back to the U.S. It's interesting that he links it to the assassinations. And then he comes back, and mysteriously he is appointed superintendent of banks in New York State, having never worked in business or finance or banking. So he's superintendent of banks, and from that position, he is made the CEO, or named the CEO of the to-be-formed Depository Trust Corp, which would hold all the dematerialized securities. So this is a CIA operation, which did not actually begin until, I believe it was 1973. So 5 years after the paperwork crisis, they started. Somehow everything worked just fine for 5 years after the rationale for starting it. Then there was no significant dematerialization until the 1980s. So for like 10 or 15 years after the paperwork crisis. So things were working just fine with paper certificates, especially with computerization. But what that really, the dematerialization is a necessary precondition for severing the property rights. With a paper certificate, there's a bright line in terms of control. Control is a key concept for taking property into bankruptcy. So there is a bright line. If you delivered your certificate into a broker and put it in your margin account so that you could lever against it, then you would clearly pass control. You had signed an agreement to allow the securities firm to use it. But when all securities are pooled in this way, they are always controlled by the ownership of those is controlled elsewhere, at least after if you don't have specific identification. You see, Sweden was identified as a problem because Sweden implemented it in a way to assure that people had property rights to their securities, even though they were dematerialized.
Yeah. And then even the Swedes decide to give in. And in the US, there's actually also proof. For example, you mentioned the Lehman case, where the protected class, like J.P. Morgan, for example, actually got preference over ordinary security holders in that bankruptcy.
Yes. Well, and that is implemented in the Uniform Commercial Code. In all 50 states. It's also in the language in the Uniform Commercial Code. And there's a lie, there's a subterfuge behind this, because what they did when they, so this was the next step. After the dematerialization, they had to change the local law. And this is what has been done in Europe. Yeah, the subversion is at the local level. So what they did was to, in the first instance, this is in Article 8 of the UCC, there's a statement that, well, let me say they created this concept of an entitlement holder. So you're no longer a shareholder or an owner. You may be termed a beneficial owner, but in the Uniform Commercial Code, there was this new concept of an entitlement holder created that hadn't existed ever in the history of securities law. And an entitlement is a contractual claim to your property. which is very weak in the event of insolvency, because you have no right to specifically take back your property. You're an unsecured creditor. So that then allows some other entity to have priority over you to your own property. So, but they implemented this in a way to hide it from people in the Uniform Commercial Code. So it begins by saying that the entitlement holders have priority over secured creditors. And this is what was mentioned in the discussion of the revision of the UCC that accompanied the legislation. Was people were assured that this was done to secure property rights for people. So it says this, that the entitlement holders have priority. But if you read to the bottom of the paragraph, it says except. And few people read to the bottom of the paragraph, it seems. And then when you go to the except, there's another paragraph that begins in the same way, saying that entitlement holders have priority, except. So you have to read further again. And when you get to the third level, you see that the exception is that when the secured creditor has control, the secured creditor has priority over the entitlement holders. It's as simple as that. So it's a subterfuge to make people think, and I've seen it happen. People read the first section, they say, what's the problem here? This is fine. But so it was done in a way to deceive.
Yeah, and have you discussed this also with other legal professionals in the US? Do they confirm what you claim?
Yeah. Absolutely. This is the basis of the legislative action in South Dakota. So,
and I saw also a letter that was co-authored by yourself, but also Griffin signed it, and a few others, where you call on state legislators to start repairing the law in order for security holders to get back their rights.
Yes, it has to. It was done at the local level. It has to be reversed at the local level.
Yeah. Now we see now in Texas how much power the local level can exert if push comes to shove. And of course, in the case of Texas, it's about protecting the border. But I can imagine that there will be certain states that will listen to you and start amending the law. Do you already see some traction there?
It's beginning, and it's happening right now in South Dakota, and it will continue in other states.
Interesting. And in Europe, for example,
I hope that can be an inspiration to people in Europe.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be changed at the EU level. It will have to be done at the national level.
Yeah, and of course, in all these different EU nations, we are bound by European law. Like, for example, in Holland, European law always comes first, and then local law. So, but I did check, of course, my brokerage account, because after reading the book, I got a little bit worried. So I checked Saxo, which is a Danish bank. I have some shares with their broker entity. And in the terms and conditions, it says that I pledge everything, but also primarily in the situation where I owe them money, they can then liquidate my shares. But it does say that they will never, without my explicit consent, hypothecate or rehypothecate my securities. But so that seems to give me some comfort, or
I think you have to read further because I don't think that's the case, because the securities are, you see, you have a national central securities depository that keeps track of who owns what in terms of beneficial ownership. So there's that record keeping at the local level. But then the securities pass to the International Central Securities Depository. That's where they're pooled. And in the case of Denmark, that's probably Euroclear.
Yeah,
It could be
true.
Clearstream, but it's probably Euroclear. And so this is the subterfuge. When the securities are pooled, the representation can be made to someone that, oh, we're not loaning out your securities, but you're still in a pool where there's no identification. So all of the securities are being used without restriction. So this is how it has worked in duping institutional investors. They're told that, oh, well, your account is segregated, and you maybe you'll pay us more for custody because we've told you what you wanted to hear, and but because the key thing here is this Federal Reserve response to the legal certainty group in Europe, which is a very hugely important, historically important document, because it's a primary source document that is absolutely irrefutable, and you can't have any authority higher than the lawyers of the New York Federal Reserve explaining how this works. And they explain that even segregated, say, have it in quotations, quote unquote, segregated accounts are subject to the same thing. They're entitled to only a pro rata share of what remains in the pool after the secured creditors take what they are able to take.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this huge shortage of collateral apparently, and there's not enough collateral to underpin this gigantic derivatives complex that we build upon on top of our financial system. We have in Holland a lawyer called Hester Bice who wrote a book, Worst Bank Scenario. She also now published it in English. Maybe you've heard of her, but otherwise I'm happy to connect you guys. But she's also been investigating primarily the Dutch financial system, but also more and more the European financial system, and she also has come to the conclusion that there's this massive shortage of collateral that is about to at some point it will then implode, and it will be like a game of musical chairs where there's just not enough chairs when everything falls down.
Well, I think that's by design. This creating this structure, this plan to sever the property rights so that these vast pools could be used without restriction. This is what has enabled the derivatives bubble. It's no coincidence that at the time that this was being enabled, essentially made legal, quote unquote legal, the derivatives complex began its hyperbolic growth at that time. So the basically what has happened here, if you go back into the documents where there's discussion of the revisions in 1994 and the reason for them, the way they describe it is they had to catch up, they had to modernize with the practice that was already underway. So the customer collateral was being used illegally on a large scale at that time. And so they then papered it over by changing the Uniform Commercial Code. They were already doing it. So in 1990, this was changed in 1994, and this is when the derivatives complex was really growing or beginning. And by 2001, 2002, it had reached about twice GDP, global GDP. And I was worried about it then. 5 years later, in 2007, it was 10 times GDP. So fivefold increase in
like
5
a financial
years.
waterhead. Yeah.
And now people, there are different estimates, but it could be 20 times global GDP. So
Yeah.
it has been enabled by this use of these pools of securities globally to underpin this, but it has also been promoted to grow even beyond that collateral. So now this is why this was done. It's an intelligent design. What they did was to sever property rights to the securities, turn those into contractual claims so that they will have no priority in the insolvency. And then the derivatives contracts, which always were contracts, so they would have had no standing in the bankruptcy, they've given only certain secured creditors super priority to the customer collateral. This is the subversion. It's very neat what they did. So the bubble, I believe the bubble is by design as well, because as I say, derivatives are not real things. They're contracts written describing other things, but they can be used to take real things. And that's what we have here. It's like the old-fashioned way of doing this was through indebtedness, causing people to become indebted so you could take their stuff when you had a downturn. Well, this is design. This is a new innovation, which is using unreal things to take the real things from people who are
very clever in that sense. But because we've seen this before, right? In the 30s, that's also what inspired you, I think, to write a book, because your family experienced firsthand the Great Depression, and that was also a kind of great taking, but then probably on a smaller scale compared to what's going to happen. But what is how did they pull it off then?
Well, it's very interesting, and Ed Griffin. It's part of the reason I wanted to go to see him. He had gone into the memoirs of the people that were present at the meeting that planned the Federal Reserve, and so this meeting was there. They basically created a financial crisis in 1907, which not many people know about. And that was used as a rationale for the imperative for creating some kind of reform of the banking system. So this group met in 1910, and from the memoirs, which I haven't reviewed, but he has, their main concern of the people in this banking cartel, that's what it was. Their main concern was that the bulk of the growth in banking was outside their control. It was independent banks in the West and the South of the United States, and that industry in the United States was doing so well, it was self-financing, did not need their credit. And they developed a plan to gain control over everything, which if you look at it from the vantage point of history, is exactly what they did. Now, people have to face up to this. What did they do to make that happen? They literally destroyed the economy, and to a large extent, the global economy, to do that. So the Federal Reserve started in essentially the beginning of 1914. These things are born in war. They're joined at the hip with warfare. And what they did was to create the money out of thin air to buy treasury bonds. And so now the public is paying interest to them on all the financing of the First World War. That is the beginning of their incredible power. Then they use those treasury bonds that they bought with money created out of nothing as their capital base to make loans to the public. So they lever up on something they've created out of nothing. So really, all of the efforts of and energies of the society go into paying them interest on these debts. It's a debt-based money system they've created out of nothing. So the war was key to escalating that power. Then they created a boom and a bust through the 1920s and the end of the 1920s. So it was done in fairly short order. And in that bust, the Great Depression, they closed all the banks just over a weekend, and literally no banks were allowed to reopen other than the banks controlled by the Federal Reserve System. So they put all of their competitors out of business, literally. And they kept economic conditions very tight, seemingly inexplicably. No one really understands why they did that. But if you understand the strategy, if you keep price levels low for years, people can't recover to pay off their debts. So 80 or 90% of all public companies were bankrupt, and they were taken over by the senior secured lenders and bondholders. But the other thing is that the gold held by the public, which was broadly held, was confiscated as well in 1933 after the bank holiday. And the rationale was that the Fed had to have the gold in order to expand credit, but then they did not expand credit. What was the real reason? It was so that the public would not have any gold. If the public had had gold, the economy could have carried on without them. So this was a comprehensive plan to crush any parallel system, any alternative to their credit creation being the sole credit available in the economy. And it worked very well. They absolutely achieved that.
And do you think gold will be confiscated again this time? Because in your thesis, it's primarily the focus will be on stocks and bonds that are held in pooled form by these depositories that will be used as collateral by all these derivatives and central counterparties. And of course, behind them are then the central banks and the big money makers. But something like gold, for example, will that also be under threat in this great taking scenario?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that gold is not the basis of the collateral in this system. But that doesn't mean that they won't eventually get around to taking it. So it might not be the first, if you hold that, you might not be the first to fall, so to speak. But if they are able to consolidate complete control through this, they do not want there to be any alternative to their money creation, their credit creation. So they're not going to have tolerance for parallel systems or means of exchange. And that's why ultimately there is no place to hide from this. It just has to be stopped.
Yeah, and because that would apply then also to crypto, for example, Bitcoin, stuff like alternative assets like that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then another similarity with the years that you described at the start of the previous century. Now, of course, there's also a lot of warfare going on. So we already see a lot of calls in Europe for a war machine. We need to build a war economy. We have to be all very afraid of this big war coming up. In Holland, for example, there's this emergency law from 1978 that would allow the government to confiscate our assets in order to for example, to finance itself in case of emergency. What do you think will be the pretext or the trigger for the great taking to take place? Is it something like the war we are currently seeing, or is it something else? Perhaps climate, or maybe interest rates that will skyrocket at some point? Or
yeah, well, I think the interest rate reversal has already resulted in many tens of trillions of dollars of losses that are being hidden right now. The scale is mind-boggling. So we're very close to something happening just because of that. But the system is being propped up for the time being. Um, the As you probably observe, we're in a global hybrid war. This is a full spectrum thing with psychological operations and threats of all kinds coming at people. Um, the way I explain this is that their money creation, creating money out of nothing, is an awesome power to begin with, and when you have a finite money system and you begin creating money out of thin air, that money has a very high velocity. In other words, projects are done that wouldn't have been done otherwise, and that money gets turned over many times. So it's a high multiplier on that created money, and it goes into real things. It may actually do good, and it may be in the real economy, but a point is reached of exhaustion in that. And the global system was reaching that after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. This is the point where the money creation by central banks went to being a high multiple of any economic growth that was occurring. So I was studying that at that time and aware that this meant that we were in an end stage phenomena for this. But it's such a big geopolitical event that it takes decades to play out. It's not a couple of years.
Because they had the chance then, and with the dot-com crisis, the great financial crisis, the COVID meltdown, there were a few moments where the Great Taking could have been implemented already, or wasn't the legal system set up properly yet?
They weren't ready yet. That's the answer. Each of those things was used. They made these things happen. They made the dot-com bubble happen. They were, by the end of 1999, they were growing money at a 40% annual rate. That was the peak of the dot-com bubble. I knew that. I was following that in real time. I knew they were doing it. So if I knew, Alan Greenspan knew they were doing that. Why were they doing it? They create these bubbles and bust. And right on the heels of the dot-com bust, that's when Europe was being pressured to harmonize with the essentially with the Uniform Commercial Code approach to property over securities. So that was beginning in 2002. Then they needed to get to the point of changing the safe harbor laws to allow the protected class to take the securities, and that was in 2005. They had a couple of things to get done yet, and then the Lehman Brothers case was used to cement the case law around that, but also that financial crisis. This is very important. Was used to drive the rationale for central clearing of all derivatives trades. Prior to that, they had been bilateral. So you knew who your counterparty was. Originally derivative contracts were good things. It was like a farmer selling his crop forward at a date when it was harvested, locking in a price, and there was a buyer that was happy to buy at that price. These were arm's length, sensible contracts. But people get confused about what derivatives are. It's just a contract. It can be written on absolutely anything. So that crisis was used as a rationale, they said, well, having a counterparty is too risky. So we're going to centralize all of that. So you don't have another party. You don't have to worry about them. You have the central clearing counterparty as your counterparty. What they didn't tell people is there's no capitalization under these central clearing counterparties. It is tiny in the scheme of things, and that even people within these entities and in associated entities are talking about the fact that they are going to fail, that all the risk has been concentrated there. And that is the end game of this. It's an integral part of the design. So when you say, why did it take so long? Well, they had some stuff to get done first. They had a checklist. They needed to establish these central clearing counterparties. So the great financial crisis was used to do that. And then it took a few years yet, 2014, to get the CSDR in place in Europe. So they had stuff they had to do, and now they're ready.
And when did you end your last hedge funds? What year was that? When you stopped with your
I wound up my hedge funds in 2005.
What was the name of your last one?
Really, it was the end of 2004. I stopped the end of 2004.
Oh, nice. And what was the name of your last venture?
It was called Varus, Verus.
Nice.
So it's the same strategy I had used before, but let's say the last couple of years I was doing it was not fun, because that's what happened was when I was managing through the dot-com bubble and bust, I was monitoring the M3 money supply figures released by the New York Fed, and or it may have been the St. Louis Fed data, but it was reflecting the open market operations of the New York Fed. And so I could see the rate of growth in money. And I was the only person doing this, it seems. And I could see money was always growing, but you could see week by week whether it was accelerating or decelerating, the rate of growth. And that allowed me to know, okay, they're stepping on the pedal here. And I had 2 or 3 days to get positioned for a sharp move up in the market. And then it worked the other way. If it started decelerating after run up, I knew, okay, we're going to roll over again soon. And I could get positioned in the other way. What happened in March of 2003 is there was a day in March of 2003 where everything went up simultaneously. The bond market was prices were going up on bonds, meaning interest rates were falling, but also every sector of the stock market was going up. Now, prior to that, the markets used to be a fairly closed system. You had the Fed creating money, but it wasn't on the scale to drive up everything at the same time. Now, to have everything go up simultaneously, there was no source of funds. It used to be that you would see a rotation. In order for one thing to go up, something else was going down. You could see the rotation occurring. In March, it was clear that there was some hidden hand injecting just an enormous amount of liquidity in order to drive everything up simultaneously. And I knew then that this is actually when quantitative easing began. It wasn't officially acknowledged until 5 years later, but it was actually beginning then. So it really took away the principal tool that I had used to be able to determine where things were going. But I had stayed at it for 2 years because I interpreted this as sheer desperation that they were doing this. Because at the time they went to that, I could see that the velocity of money was actually collapsing at that time, and that commercial and industrial loans in the United States were falling. So the real economy was falling. And there were things like looking at delinquencies on utility payments by the rate base. In some utilities, it was a third of the rate base who was not paying their utility bills, and things like home foreclosure rates were skyrocketing. But they then went in and they changed that data. This is another story, how the economic data was being changed to fit the story that everything was great. And then they used all this money creation to create the asset-backed securities bubble, which is another story.
Yeah. And then maybe to wrap up, if so people can, of course, try to convince their legislators, whether it's in the US or in Europe, to try to change the laws in order to avoid this fate from happening. But also, let's say this would happen, wouldn't then people rise up massively? Like if we all wake up and there's a bank holiday, a bit like we saw in Greece or Cyprus, and people cannot access their banks, but also they basically lose their pensions and their shares. That would, I mean, we've seen farmers protest across Europe because of diesel prices, but this is even more severe and massive. That this would lead to a revolution, I would say, and that's not in the best interest of the elites either to have this revolution taking place.
No, I'm not saying. Well, I guess as I say, there's an intelligence behind it, but they're insane. They're what they're doing.
Yeah, it's self-destructive, even, right? It's suicidal for them because we won't accept this, right? I'm not going to accept this for sure.
Well, I think they're emboldened because in the Great Depression in the 30s, it worked. They were successful.
Yeah, people were misinformed. They were not informed. Now we have all the alternative media. We have social media. We have all sorts of ways to inform ourselves and also to misinform ourselves. But I would at least expect this to disseminate across the internet, or maybe they will also censor the internet even more. Of course, in Europe we have the Digital Service Act and everything. But yeah, maybe I'm too hopeful, but.
It's so important that we use the freedoms we have remaining to us to spread awareness of this with urgency now, and to begin. This is our hope. It's that this is so apparent and irrefutable. The deliberate plan behind this taking of all the securities. And it's implemented comprehensively globally, that it will injure everyone and all the way to the top of the system. And so for the first time, there's the real, I would say, inevitability of uniting people. So divide and rule will not work, as you're saying. People will have something to say about this, but it's the fear here is that the people behind this, they're engaged in a full spectrum hybrid war plan here. They've planned a long time for this, and the longer they're allowed to go, they will increasingly move toward hurting a lot of people. This is what happens. That's actually their old strategy. The central banking power has always been involved with warfare and totalitarianism. They've backed every totalitarian project. So that's where we're going. And at the end of a cycle like this, when the money is no longer driving real economic beneficial activity, as we see, it goes into financialization and into warfare. This is the threat we all face, is that the violence, they're going to escalate the violence globally. That's why it's a world war. They make it so. So we have to realize there are always psychopaths, sociopaths, whatever you want to call them. They've always been with us. There is a portion of the population. There are always people with crazy ideas that can have these schemes. The problem is giving them unlimited funding. And that's what we have allowed. And the only way we can save ourselves is to stop the central bank power to do this. The linkage of the central bank power with warfare must be ended.
Well, that's very clear, and also I guess that means we should definitely oppose the further development of central bank digital currencies, because they would provide the ultimate tool in the end then to central bankers to wield their power.
Yes, I think it is going. That's what they want to achieve here, is creating such dire conditions that people will have no alternative. There will be no parallel system to which they can resort. So they will be forced to accept the central bank digital currency, or as Whitney Webb is now explaining, they can create a private sector solution that nonetheless the central banks are behind, and something hung off of stable coins. There are different ways to do it, but it's really the same thing.
Right. And maybe a final word of advice from you, David, for our listeners. So apart from that, they should try to make a legislative change happen. What can someone else do, like personally, in order to either avert this fate or prepare for it or hedge himself?
Well, I'm very careful about that, because obviously we should get out of debt if we can do that, sell things and pay off all debts. But there are lots of people that aren't going to be able to do that, and so I have compassion for those people, and I want to say, don't do anything that will destroy your happiness and your marriage and the happiness of your children. We will get through this. You have lots of neighbors who are all in debt. We will. The important thing is to look after your physical reality over this period of time. You can't eat Bitcoin. You can't eat gold. You want to have a pantry with supplies. If you can produce food, we can see that they're going after the food supply. If you can produce food, that's a good thing to do. So we know there are going to be disruptions. We're in a war. You can see it already. So it's but ultimately the world is benevolent. The real world is benevolent. If they work at this stuff. They work at what they're doing in the financial system, and they work to create wars. And if that just stopped, everything gets better right away.
I'm looking forward to that, David. Thanks so much for being on the show. People can read the book when they go to thegreattaking.com. And of course, they should also watch the documentary that you made out of the book. Really urge people to read everything and also try to refute, of course, everything that David says is important. Look everything up, but it's completely substantiated with all sorts of legal material as well. So thanks so much, David, for the work you've done, and you've provided it for free, so the whole world can read it. Let's do it again in the future. If you're ever in Holland, let me know, and we can also do a studio recording like I did with Catherine. It would be nice.
Thank you, Paul. Enjoy.
Thanks so much, David.